following the events at Notting Hill Carnival that left 3 people fighting for their lives, questions have been raised over the rise of so-called two-tiered policing in the UK. Over the course of that weekend, 334 people were arrested with little condemnation at all from the political sphere. Now, critics claim that the policing and judicial system is currently treating certain groups more favourably than others. And joining me now to discuss this is the social policy analyst, Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Rakib, always a pleasure to have you on the show. You've written an excellent column in today's Daily Mail calling out what you perceive as two-tier policing, and you think it's getting worse. Tell us more.
No, absolutely. And Martin, I'll make the point that this is much broader than two-tier policing. I call it two-tier governance. It includes policing, but also how our politicians react to various social events. It does involve our criminal justice system as well. Now, looking at Notting Hill Carnival, we saw 334 arrests, 50 police officers injured, dozens of people arrested for possession of an offensive weapon. We saw 8 stabbings over a period of 2 days, 3 left with life-threatening injuries, one being a 32-year-old mother who was with her child on so-called family day. And I would make this point. There's been hardly any political condemnation of this violence and criminality. And if this took place at, say, a St. George's parade, St. George's Day parade, which was celebrating Anglo-Saxon traditions and culture, I can guarantee you that the political reaction would be very different. There would be plenty of condemnation. So I think here what we're talking about is how our politicians react to various social events, depending on the background, the ethnic, racial and religious background of those involved.
And Rakib, you draw excellent parallels with the grooming gang scandal, Indeed. With the pro-Palestine protests, the Black Lives Matter marches, and you make an excellent point, I think very beautifully at the end of your article, where you talk about Lady Justice on the Old Bailey with a blindfold, and you make the point that you feel that our political class, our media class, they're also, in a sense, blindfolded. They don't want to see the truth before them. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I think we've made significant strides when it comes to racial equality in our country, especially over the last 25 years or so. But I think in some ways the pendulum was swung too far in the other direction, where, especially when it comes to matters of law and order, I think in some cases it's clear that minorities have been the beneficiaries of preferential treatment. You talked about the grooming gang cases, especially in Greater Manchester, which is very relevant because, as you know, with the Manchester Airport incident, where one female police officer was left hospitalised with a broken nose, people reacting to that incident by saying that this actually demonstrated how Greater Manchester Police, in some ways, is uniquely heavy-handed when it comes to men of Pakistani Muslim heritage. Well, I'm sorry to say I couldn't disagree more with that. And I think when you look at the premature closing down of Operation Augusta, which was primarily investigating male grooming gang perpetrators of Pakistani Muslim heritage, the fact that that was prematurely closed down suggests the exact opposite. So I think that what's very clear here is that we need our politicians, not just our politicians, we need public sector officials, especially when it comes to policing, local councils, healthcare, in our education system, to operate in the spirit of fairness, balance and impartiality. Otherwise, it could not only fuel considerable social resentment, it could even exacerbate the potential for political unrest. And we don't want to be in that position.
Now, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, an excellent article. You've got a real brave head on you. Thank you very, very much for coming on the show today. It's always a pleasure to have your company. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Now, moving on, currently there are 1.6 million migrants living in Britain that are unemployed or not actively looking for any form of work. Now, that costs the taxpayer an astonishing £8 billion every year, and that's according to the Centre for Migration Control. Now, this comes, of course, as the government says the figure doesn't take into account individual circumstances, but the true figure could even be higher. And for more on this, I'm joined now by Research Director at the Centre for Migration Control, Robert Bates. Rob, welcome to the show. Always a delight to have your company. A simply astonishing set of numbers. £8 billion per year. Nobody voted for any of this. People voted repeatedly to try and stop it. And yet here we are. Talk us through some of these incredible numbers.
Great to be with you, Martin. So look, all we've really done here is add to the rich panoply of existing research in this area, the data and those that are kind of exploring this issue, that shows that the economic panacea we were promised with the mass migration experiment when it was embarked on in the late 1990s simply hasn't materialised. And in fact, what it is actually doing is imposing a huge cost on the British taxpayer. In this specific report, what we've discovered is that there's now a record number of migrants, those born outside the UK, either unemployed or economically inactive. Now, what economically inactive basically means is they're not actively seeking a role in the UK economy. We've calculated using methodology produced by the Migration Advisory Committee, which are the official Home Office advisors. We've calculated that this roughly will burden the British taxpayer with about 8.5 billion pounds per year. Now, what we've done is we've been deliberately very conservative with this estimate. We've actually over-egged the amount that we can expect via revenue from these migrants via indirect taxes such as VAT and alcohol duty and whatnot. We've actually overstated the amount that they're probably paying in. So the figure could probably be anywhere between 8.5 billion and 11 or 12 billion.
And actually, Rob, when you look into some of the more detailed figures on this report estimates if you add in other costs, such as health, NHS costs, education costs, transport and housing, the true cost to the British taxpayer could be £20.3 billion. That's the burden placed upon taxpayers. Now, the big question now, Rob, is what can we do about this? Time and time again, we've just heard from Chris Hope. The Tory leadership candidates are pitching in for their bid to be the Conservative leader, but they've had their chance time and time again. We've talked about an Australian point-style system. We've seen in France and in Germany, indeed today, placing caps or even blocks on the ability of asylum seekers or coming in to be able to claim benefits. What do people tell you when you speak to your punters at the Centre for Migration Control? What would voters like to see put in place, Rob?
Well, when we speak to people, and this is probably a similar experience when you have your guests on, is that we have a kind of sense of, well, what can we do about it? We've sent very clear messages in successive general elections now. We had a referendum on an issue basically orientated around migration as well. And the fact of the matter is that people feel, well, what more can we do? You were discussing previously the Tory leadership contest. I would argue that we're being grossly suffering a gross disservice with what's currently going on with the Conservative Party, because as you've discussed, not one of them was prepared to apologise for their huge failures. But really, the whole contest should be centred around how are we going to bring down these catastrophically high numbers that are flowing into the country every year. We've got 1.2 million, it came out last week, of received a long-term visa in the last 12 months. And the fact of the matter is that we all know the Labour Party aren't going to do anything. And traditionally, those of us that are slightly on the Conservative side of things would look to the Tory Party and think, well, they are probably our best bet. But I mean, if you look at the options that we've got on offer at the moment, you kind of have to think, well, where is the sensible politics coming from? I would argue as well that the Reform Party really need to up their ante on this issue. I think they're sadly at the moment too passive with this issue, and they should be a lot more gung-ho, really trying to set the agenda rather than just simply responding to news stories as and when they break. There's so much more that they can be doing to really give people hope that someone is listening to them, telling them the problems. That's what the public want to hear. They want to hear that there's politicians that recognise the crisis that this country is facing, and they're not just insane when they look around and think, this country isn't, the same that it was when I grew up in. The economic costs that I'm suffering don't seem fair when we're stacked up against, the unemployment figures that we're seeing from migrants here as well.
OK, we have to leave it there, Rob Bass. Pleasure. And, of course, Yvette Cooper and the Labour Party will point out they have pledged to get 14,500 illegal workers out of the country by the end of the year. They've also pledged to get the gangs smashed up. And also, Rob's got a quick statement from the government here, which I need to read out on this topic. They said it is incorrect to apply an average cost to migrants out of work, as estimates need to take into account individual circumstances. Most education and welfare costs are not applicable to working age migrants. migrants who are not students. I think the point is that this report doesn't include students. This is just those not looking for work. Rob Bates, I can see you furrowing your brow, but I'm afraid we simply have to move on. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. It's always an absolute pleasure.